The lane from the village to the marsh is a single track of packed earth worn smooth by generations of feet, and in the hour before dawn it lies under a sky that is still holding the last of the night. You walk it as you have walked it 1,000 times, your body knowing the way before your eyes can find it. The air is cool on your face and on your hands, cool enough that you feel it in your throat when you breathe, but not cold. Never cold in a dry English summer. There is a particular smell that rises from the ground at this hour, a smell of dust and old straw and the faint animal warmth of the earth itself giving back the heat it stored the day before. It mixes with the sharper scent of brine that comes in from the sea on the slightest movement of air, so that every few steps the balance shifts from inland sweetness to salt. Your rake rests on your shoulder, the long handle worn to a smooth polish where your palms have held it season after season. The wood is ash, light and strong, and the tines at the end are carved from a single piece, spaced evenly like the teeth of a comb, but thicker, blunter, designed not to cut but to stir and gather. The basket slung over your other shoulder is wide and shallow, woven from willow withes cut from the banks of the river that feeds the marsh, and it creaks very softly with the rhythm of your walking, a sound so familiar that you would notice only if it stopped. Inside the basket there is a clay bottle of water wrapped in a damp cloth to keep it cool, a small linen bundle with bread and a wedge of hard cheese, and a flat wooden scoop you will use later in the day when the salt is ready to lift. These are the simple contents of a simple day, and they settle against the wicker with a quiet rustle as you walk. The path runs between hedgerows at first, hawthorn and blackthorn tangled together in a dense dark mass that on either side rises taller than a man. In the deep shadow of the hedge, the world is still monochrome, all greys and soft blacks, and the leaves hold the night's dew in heavy drops that sometimes fall without warning onto the dust, with a sound like a tiny breath. You can hear small birds stirring in the thicket, not yet singing, but making those first tentative chirps and rustles that test the silence before the full chorus begins. A blackbird, perhaps, a hedge sparrow, the soft coo of a wood pigeon from somewhere deeper in the field beyond. The sounds come to you as if from a great distance, even though they are close, because your mind is still moving slowly, still half in the sleep from which you rose when the sky was fully dark and the stars were still bright. After a while the hedgerows thin out and give way to open ground, and here the path becomes slightly softer underfoot as it enters the first of the marsh pastures. The grass on either side is long and pale from the summer drought, not green, but a kind of silvery gold that in this low light looks almost white. It moves constantly in the faint breeze that always seems to blow across the marsh, a breeze that never quite stops but never grows strong either, just a steady movement of air that rustles the grass with a dry whispering sound like paper being turned very slowly, page after page after page. The grass whispers and the path continues, and your footsteps make a soft padding noise now instead of the harder scuff they made on the packed earth of the lane. You cross a small wooden bridge over a creek, and the sound of your footsteps changes again, becomes hollow and resonant for 5 paces, before returning to the muffled softness of the marsh path. Below the bridge the water moves in near silence, just a faint gurgle where it twists around a submerged root, and in the darkness it looks like a ribbon of polished slate sliding smoothly towards the sea. The tide is on its way out, still high enough to fill the channels, but dropping steadily, pulling the water from the marsh in a slow exhalation that has been going on since long before you woke and will continue long after. Now you begin to see the first signs of the saltern itself. The land flattens out completely, and the vegetation changes, becomes sparser and tougher. Salt-tolerant plants like sea purslane and glasswort take over from the sweet grasses, their fleshy leaves holding water against the brine. The path divides into smaller tracks, each one leading to a different set of pans, and you take the leftmost fork without thinking, turning towards the eastern pans where the morning sun will reach first, and the brine is always a little warmer. The wooden uprights of a wind pump appear against the paling sky, a tall, slender structure with a great wheel of slatted wood that turns slowly in the breeze with a rhythmic creak that carries across the flat water. It is the only mechanical sound in the whole landscape, and it is so steady, so unhurried, that it becomes less a noise and more a part of the silence itself. The light has been changing all this while, And now as you approach the pans, you can see the first true color seeping into the world. The eastern sky above the distant line of the sea has shifted from black to a deep indigo, and at its very edge, a band of pale grey-blue is widening and brightening, pushing the darkness westward. A few clouds are suspended there, thin and stretched out like pulled wool, and their undersides catch the first faint hint of warmth. Not yet pink or gold, but a kind of soft peach that seems almost too delicate to last. The water in the pans ahead of you reflects this sky exactly, so that the earth and the heavens are the same color. And as you walk the last stretch of the path, it seems that you are walking into the sky itself, your feet on solid ground, but your eyes in the clouds. The pans come into full view now, a neat pattern of shallow rectangles laid out across the marsh like a giant's game board, each one separated from the next by low earthen walls, about the width of a man's foot and perhaps 2 feet high. They are not perfectly square but slightly elongated, running north to south so that the sun will strike them evenly throughout the day, and they decrease in size and depth as they move inland from the sea. The first pans, the ones nearest the tidal creek, are the largest and deepest, still dark with the fall seawater that was let in at the last spring tide. Their surface is ruffled by the breeze into tiny wavelets that lap almost soundlessly at the clay banks. The middle pans are shallower and greyer, the brine in them already concentrated by weeks of evaporation, their clarity somehow thicker, more syrupy than ordinary water. And then there are the crystallization pans, the ones you tend, the final stage before the harvest. They are the shallowest of all, only a few inches deep, and their surfaces are utterly still, glassy and perfect, because the brine in them is so dense that the wind cannot easily disturb it. You stop at the edge of your first pan and set down the basket, leaning the rake against your shoulder for a moment while you look out across the water. The pan before you is perhaps 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, a perfect rectangle of mirror-smooth brine that holds the entire sky in its surface. Around its edges, a thin white line of dried salt crusts the clay, and here and there across the bottom you can see the faint sparkle of tiny crystals that have formed overnight, a dusting of translucent cubes that catch the growing light and scatter it into pinpricks of brilliance. The water itself is absolutely clear, clearer than any freshwater pond, and you can see every detail of the pan's floor, the smooth packed silt, the occasional small stone worn round by years of immersion, the faint parallel grooves left by yesterday's raking still visible, like a faded script written on the bottom. You remove your shoes now, as you always do, because the leather would disturb the brine too much, and because you need to feel the bottom with your feet to know where the salt is thickest. You place them side by side on the bank next to the basket, and the cool air feels pleasant on your bare skin. The clay of the bank is still damp from the night and slightly slippery, and you step down into the pan with the care of long practice, your foot breaking the surface with a soft liquid sound that seems very loud in the quiet of the dawn. The brine closes over your ankle, cool at first touch, but not unpleasantly so. And within a few seconds it seems to match the temperature of your skin exactly, so that you can hardly feel it except as a gentle pressure. You take another step, and another, until you are standing near the center of the pan with the water just below your knees. The sun not yet risen, but the light now strong enough to cast a faint shadow of your figure across the rippling surface behind you. For a long moment you simply stand there, allowing the water to settle, allowing the tiny disturbance of your entry to dissipate outwards in concentric rings that grow wider and fainter until they are swallowed by the edges of the pan. The surface returns to its perfect stillness, and once again you can see straight down to the bottom, see your own feet pale against the dark silt, see the fine dusting of salt crystals that has appeared since yesterday evening. The crystals are at their most delicate stage right now, before the sun has had time to bake them into a hard crust, and your work this morning will be to break them up before that happens, to stir them back into the brine so they can continue growing evenly throughout the day. A hard crust would block the evaporation from the brine below and slow the whole process, and it would also trap impurities that would discolor the final harvest. So this first raking of the morning is perhaps the most important task of the day. You lift the rake from your shoulder and lower it into the water, doing it slowly so that the tines enter without a splash, sliding in at a shallow angle, the wood darkening as it becomes wet. The handle rests comfortably in your grip, your right hand near the top and your left hand lower down. and you position the rake so that the tines just barely touch the bottom, just enough to scratch the surface of the silt without digging into it. The salt you want to disturb is lying on top of the silt, in a layer no thicker than a fingernail. The silt itself you leave undisturbed because mixing mud into the brine would cloud the water and spoil the purity of the crystals. It is a delicate touch, one that took you many seasons to learn, and now it is second nature, your muscles knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly how deeply to let the tines descend. You begin. The first stroke is a push away from your body, the rake moving through the water with a gentle dragging resistance that you feel all the way up the handle into your shoulders. The tines leave 4 parallel trails in the silt, trails that immediately bloom with clouds of disturbed salt, white swirls that rise and spread like slow-motion smoke underwater. The sound of it is a soft, continuous crunching, the sound of thousands of tiny crystals scraping against each other and against the wood. A sound so quiet that you feel it more than you hear it, a vibration transmitted through the handle directly into the bones of your hands. The cloud of salt hangs suspended for a moment, turning the clear brine milky, and then it begins to settle, the larger crystals falling first and the finest particles staying in the water. A little longer, catching the light so that the whole pan seems to glow faintly from within. You take another step forward and rake again, this time pulling the tool towards you in a smooth, steady motion. The muscles in your forearms tighten and release, and your breathing slows into a rhythm that matches the movement. Push, breathe out, pull, breathe in. It does not take long for this rhythm to establish itself, for your body to settle into the work the way a boat settles into a current, and once it does, your mind is free to wander, to drift across the surface of the pan like the salt clouds, to notice the small details of the morning that are slowly revealing themselves as the light grows stronger. The sun has still not risen above the horizon, but the band of grey-blue in the east has widened and brightened until it is now a pale, clear yellow, and the thin clouds that hang there have caught fire, their edges burning gold and rose against the retreating darkness. A few more birds have begun to call. A curlew now, its long curved beak silhouetted against the brightening sky as it flies low over the marsh, and its cry is a liquid, bubbling sound that seems to rise and fall like the tide itself. From somewhere very far away, perhaps from the harbour beyond the marsh, comes the faint sound of a bell buoy tolling in the swell, a single note repeated at long intervals, so distant that it is more like a memory of a sound than a sound itself. The wind pump creaks steadily, the rake moves through the water, the salt clouds bloom and settle, and the world turns slowly towards the sun. You work your way methodically across the pan, covering every inch of the bottom with your rake, overlapping each stroke slightly with the previous one, so that no crust is left unbroken. The pattern you make is a series of long, straight lines, each one parallel to the last, and as you move, you leave behind you a trail of gently clouded water that will take perhaps half an hour to clear completely, by which time you will have finished this pan and moved on to the next. The work is repetitive in the way that all good, honest work is repetitive, not dull, but meditative. Each stroke a small, complete action that contains within it the whole purpose of the day. There is no hurry, no need to rush. The sun will do its work regardless. The water will evaporate at its own pace. The salt will form according to laws of chemistry that were laid down long before there was anyone here to watch them. And your role is simply to be present, to tend, to guide the process with a gentle hand. After a time you reach the far end of the pan and turn, facing back the way you came. The water behind you is still cloudy, a soft luminous white that hides the bottom completely, but ahead of you it is still clear, and you can see the unraked crust waiting, a delicate frost-like layer that sparkles in the growing light. You begin the return journey, pushing the rake ahead of you once more, and now you notice that the sun has finally broken free of the horizon. You feel it as a sudden warmth on the back of your neck, a gentle heat that is still pleasant at this hour, not yet the heavy oppressive blaze it will become by midday. Your shadow stretches out across the water in front of you, long and thin, a giant walking on the rippling surface, and when you look up you see the marsh transformed by the first true light of day into a landscape of extraordinary quiet beauty. The earthen walls between the pans glow a warm terracotta, the color of baked clay, and the vegetation that grows on them has turned from grey to 100 shades of green and gold. The larger pans to the east are a sheet of hammered silver, still stirred by the breeze, and the birds are fully awake now, their calls coming from every direction, a woven tapestry of sound that is rich and varied without ever being loud. A heron stands in the shallows of the nearest large pan, perfectly motionless, a grey statue waiting for its breakfast, and as you watch it makes a slow, deliberate step, lifting one stick-like leg and placing it down again without a ripple. An act of patience so complete that it makes your own quiet work seem hurried by comparison. You finish the first pan and climb out onto the bank, your legs dripping, your feet leaving wet prints on the warm clay. The brine dries almost instantly on your skin, leaving a faint white bloom of salt that feels slightly tight as you flex your toes. You pick up your basket and your shoes and walk along the narrow bank to the second pan, and when you look into it, you see that the salt crust here is slightly thinner than in the first pan, meaning the brine is less concentrated, meaning the evaporation has been a little slower in this corner of the marsh, perhaps because it catches less wind or because the clay bottom is slightly different. These are the small variations you have learned to read over many summers, the tiny differences that tell you how to adjust your work, whether to rake more deeply or more lightly, whether to let in a little fresh brine, or to let the pan concentrate a day longer before harvesting. None of it requires urgent decision. It is simply knowledge that sits in the back of your mind, as comfortable and unpressured as the knowledge of how to breathe. You step into the second pan and begin again. The rake enters the water, the tines touch the bottom, the cloud of salt rises and spreads. The sun climbs a little higher, and the day grows a little warmer, and somewhere out on the tidal creek the water continues its slow retreat towards the sea, exposing the dark mud banks where the wading birds will soon gather to feed. The work goes on, and it is still only the beginning of the morning, and there is nothing else in the world but this. Now you stand at the edge of the saltern, with the morning fully arrived, and there is a moment between tasks when the whole system of the pans lies before you, like a map drawn on the earth, a geometry of water and clay that has been refined over centuries into something so simple and so perfect that it hardly seems designed at all. The light at this hour is still low enough to throw long shadows from the earthen banks, and these shadows create a pattern of alternating bands of warm gold and cool grey that stretches away across the marsh in every direction, a quiet repetition of rectangles that pleases the eye without asking anything of it. You have finished the first raking of the eastern pans, and now you pause on the raised bank between two crystallization ponds, your rake resting upright beside you, with its handle pressed into the soft clay, your bare feet still damp with brine, and you allow yourself this small interval of stillness to look at the place where you work. The saltern is not a single pond but a chain of basins, each one feeding the next by the slow pull of gravity. And understanding this chain is like understanding the verses of a familiar song. The whole arrangement begins at the tidal creek, a wide, winding channel of dark mud and deeper water that connects the marsh to the Solent and through the Solent to the open sea. At the highest spring tides, when the moon and the sun pull together and the water rises further than it does on ordinary days, the sea pushes up the creek and presses against a great wooden sluice gate set into the marsh's outer wall. That gate, when lifted by the salt workers, lets in a rush of cold grey seawater that flows eagerly into the first of the ponds, filling it to the brim with the raw material of everything that will follow. This first intake pond is called the reservoir, and it is the largest of all the basins, deep enough that a man could not stand in it. Its bottom a thick layer of dark estuarine mud that has settled there over years of quiet stillness between the tides. From the reservoir, the water moves through a series of wooden sluices, small square openings fitted with boards that can be raised or lowered by hand. Each sluice connects one pond to the next, and because the whole marsh is built on a slope so gentle that the eye cannot detect it, the water flows from pond to pond with a motion that is almost invisible, less a current than a drift, a slow migration from higher ground to lower. The slope was not created by the builders of the saltern, it is the natural lie of the land, a slight tilt towards the sea that the first salt makers recognized and shaped to their purpose, digging their pans into the contour and letting gravity do the work that pumps and engines would do in later centuries. The second pond in the chain is slightly smaller than the reservoir and slightly shallower, and here the process of concentration begins. The water that enters from the reservoir has already lost some of its sediment, the heavier particles having settled out in the deep stillness of the first pond, and so the brine in the second basin is clearer, tinged only with the faintest green from the microscopic life that thrives in salt water. The sun falls on it day after day, and the dry summer wind skims across its surface, and slowly, molecule by molecule, the pure water rises into the air as vapor while the dissolved salt remains behind. This is the great invisible work of the saltern, the quiet miracle that no one can see happening, but that everyone trusts. Evaporation, the turning of liquid to gas, the endless upward drift of water leaving the sea behind. After the second pond comes a third, smaller and shallower still, and then perhaps a fourth depending on the layout of the particular saltern. Each successive basin holds the brine for a little longer, lets it grow a little denser, until by the time the water reaches the crystallization pans, it is no longer properly water at all, but a heavy, almost oily solution that glints with a slight metallic sheen when the light catches it from the side. The journey from the reservoir to the crystallization pans might take weeks in the height of summer, the brine moving so slowly between the stages that a particular molecule of water, if one could follow it, would seem to spend most of its time simply resting, waiting, basking under the sun in a state of suspended purpose. You know this journey intimately, not as a thing you have measured, but as a thing you feel. When you dip your hand into the reservoir, the water is cool and thin and tastes of the sea, but not strongly. It is still a wild thing, full of the open water's memory. When you dip your hand into the middle pans, the brine is noticeably warmer, heated by weeks of shallow sunlight, and it leaves your skin feeling slightly slippery, almost soapy, and if you taste a drop, it is sharp and bitter and makes your lips tingle. And when you dip your hand into your own crystallization pan, the brine is warm as blood, and so dense that a drop dried on your finger leaves a visible white crust within seconds. It tastes so intensely of salt that it stings, and you know that it is ready, that the long, slow journey from the sea is almost complete. The pan where you work, the one you have just raked, and the one where you will spend most of your day is one of perhaps 20 such crystallization pans arranged in a grid at the southern edge of the saltern. It is a shallow rectangle measuring roughly 40 feet in length and 20 feet in width, its floor dug into the natural clay of the marsh and lined with a layer of packed silt that has been smoothed and re-smoothed over many seasons until it is as even as a tabletop. The walls that define its edges are built up from the same clay, reinforced with bundles of marsh grass and reeds that have been trampled into the mud to give it strength, and they rise about 2 feet above the surface of the brine, wide enough to walk along comfortably, but narrow enough that you must pay attention to your footing. The walls are not just boundaries, they are also pathways, the network of routes that connect every part of the saltern to every other part. You can walk from the reservoir to the farthest crystallization pan without ever stepping off the raised banks, and in the course of a day you will walk many of these routes, checking the sluices, observing the brine, carrying your basket of harvested salt to the storage shed. The tops of the walls are planted here and there with tough salt-tolerant grasses that help bind the clay together, their roots threading through the earth like stitching, and in the cracks between the clay blocks grow small colonies of sea lavender whose purple flowers will appear later in the summer, adding a faint sweetness to the brine-heavy air. Standing on the bank between your two pans, you can look directly down into the water and see the bottom with perfect clarity. The silt floor is not perfectly featureless. It bears the marks of your own recent passing, the long parallel grooves of the rake still visible through the slowly clearing brine, and here and there are the small round depressions where you planted your feet as you worked. There are other marks too, older ones, traces of previous days that have been partly smoothed over by the gentle settling of disturbed silt, but not entirely erased, the faint curved line where a basket was set down on the bottom, the shallow divot where a stone was picked out and discarded, the slightly deeper patch in one corner where the silt was repaired after a winter storm eroded it. These are the small archives of the saltern, the record of work written not in ink but in mud, read by no one but remembered by the hands that made them. The water itself, now that the morning is growing warmer, has begun to show the first signs of the day's evaporation. Around the very edges of the pan, where the brine is shallowest and the clay banks radiate the sun's heat back into the water, A thin white crust has already started to form again, despite your early raking. It appears first as a faint haze on the surface, almost like a breath misting a cold window, and then it thickens into a delicate skin that cracks into tiny geometric plates as the water beneath it continues to retreat. The plates curl slightly at their edges, turning upwards like the petals of microscopic flowers, and they are so fragile that the merest touch would shatter them into powder. You lean down from the bank and dip a finger into the water, watching the way the surface skin breaks and reforms, a tiny drama of creation and dissolution playing out in the space of a few inches. The brine has a particular smell when it is at this stage of concentration, a clean, sharp smell that is not quite the smell of the sea and not quite the smell of dry salt, but something in between, something that evokes both the vast openness of the ocean and the intimate enclosure of the pans. It is a smell that fills the whole marsh on a warm summer day, rising from the water in invisible waves, coating the inside of your nose and the back of your throat, so that even hours later, when you are far from the saltern, you can still taste it faintly on your breath. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is the smell of work, of the transformation of one thing into another, of the patient collaboration between sun and water and earth. Beyond the crystallization pans, at the very end of the chain, there are the drying pans, which are not pans of water at all, but broad, shallow basins of packed clay where the harvested salt is spread out to drain and dry before it is taken to the store. These pans are empty now, their clay floors cracked into 1,000 interlocking polygons by the summer heat, the cracks filled with a fine white dust that sparkles when the sun strikes it at the right angle. A few stray crystals from yesterday's harvest lie scattered across the surface, missed by the broom, and they catch the light like tiny diamonds dropped carelessly on the brown earth. Later in the day, when you have gathered enough salt, you'll come here and spread the damp white heap across one of these pans, raking it out into a thin, even layer so that the sun can finish the work of driving off the last moisture. But that is still hours away, and for now the drying pans wait empty and patient, their cracks widening imperceptibly as the morning grows warmer. The whole system of the saltern, from the reservoir to the drying pans, is arranged according to a logic that is both practical and beautiful, a logic that comes from paying close attention to the way water behaves when it is left alone. There are no straight lines in nature, or rather there are very few, but the saltern is an exception because water itself, when it is still and shallow and bounded by clay, wants to be level, wants to find the horizontal plane and hold it with a kind of quiet determination. The pans are straight-sided because straight sides are easiest to build and easiest to work, and they are rectangular because rectangles fit together without wasting space. But their straightness is softened by the materials of which they are made, the crumbling clay, the tufted grass, the weathered wood of the sluices, so that they never feel rigid or imposed. They feel as though they have grown out of the marsh, the way a hedgerow grows, half planted and half volunteered. Now the sun has climbed high enough that the shadows are beginning to shorten, the long dark bands of early morning contracting into narrow strips of coolness at the base of each bank. The light is no longer golden, but a clear, pale white that seems to press down on the water with a gentle weight, and the heat is becoming noticeable, a warmth that starts on the skin and gradually seeps inward until it reaches the bones. The birds have settled into the quieter rhythms of mid-morning. The curlew's bubbling call has faded, replaced by the steady hum of insects in the marsh grass and the occasional sharp cry of a gull wheeling high overhead, its shadow racing across the pans faster than a man could run. The wind pump continues its slow rotation, creaking steadily, and the great slatted wheel flashes as it turns, light and shadow alternating across its surface in a rhythm that never varies. You pick up your rake and walk along the bank towards your third pan of the morning, the one that lies at the western edge of your section, where the marsh begins to rise very slightly towards the inland fields. This pan is a little different from the others, not in its construction, but in its behavior. It lies in a spot that catches the afternoon sun more directly and loses its water faster, so the brine here is always a few days ahead of the other pans in its concentration. The crust that formed overnight was thicker here, you noticed when you passed it earlier, and it will need a slightly firmer hand with the rake, a little more pressure on the tines to break through the crystalline layer without gouging the silt beneath. These are the small adjustments that the work requires, the constant quiet conversation between the salt maker and the salt, and they are so deeply familiar, that you make them without conscious thought, the way a sailor adjusts the tiller to a shift in the wind. You step down into the pan and feel the bottom under your feet, the silt firm and cool through the dense brine. The water here is slightly shallower than in the first two pans, barely reaching the middle of your calves, and the crystals on the bottom are visibly larger, their cubic shapes discernible as individual grains rather than as a collective frost. They crunch softly under your weight as you settle into your stance, and when you introduce the rake into the water, you feel the increased resistance immediately, a slight thickening of the medium through which the tines must travel. The work begins again, stroke after stroke, push and pull, the same steady rhythm that you established in the first pan, and will maintain throughout the morning. The salt cloud rises, the sun climbs, the day unfolds itself in perfect unhurried sequence, and the geometry of the pans holds everything in its quiet order, a grid of water and clay and patient labor drawn across the marsh like a lullaby written on the earth. With the morning now fully settled into its slow climb towards noon, you stand at the edge of the third pan and let your gaze travel across its surface one more time before you step in. The light has changed since you finished the first two pans. It is brighter now and a little more direct, falling on the water at an angle that turns the brine into a sheet of pale blue glass. The crust that formed overnight is plainly visible, a continuous white film that covers the entire bottom like a fall of fine snow, and in the very center of the pan where the water is shallowest, the crust has thickened enough to crack on its own, the cracks radiating outward in a pattern like the veins of a leaf. This is the sign you look for, the signal that the brine is ready for its first disturbance of the day, and you feel the familiar small readiness pass through your hands, a slight tightening of the grip on the rake handle that is not tension but attention. You step down from the bank, placing your bare foot on the clay slope just below the waterline, and the brine accepts your weight with a soft liquid sound that is quickly swallowed by the wider silence. The bottom here is particularly smooth, the silt having been packed and repacked many times over the season, and your foot sinks into it only a fraction of an inch before finding a firmness that is almost like walking on damp leather. The water rises to just below your knees, a little shallower than in the first two pans, and you feel the coolness of it moving up your legs in a single slow wave that reaches your waist before dissipating into the general warmth of the morning. You take two more steps, three, until you're positioned near the edge of the crust's thickest patch, and then you pause to let the water settle around you, to allow the small ripples of your entry to travel outwards and fade against the clay walls. The rake is in your hands now, held in the familiar grip that you have known since you were old enough to work the pans beside your elders. Your right hand rests near the top of the handle, palm facing downward, fingers curled loosely around the smooth wood. Your left hand grips lower down, about a foot above the point where the handle meets the crosspiece that holds the tines, and this hand does most of the guiding, the small adjustments of angle and pressure that determine how the rake moves through the water. The tines themselves are 4 in number, carved from a single piece of ash and spaced about 3 inches apart, their tips worn to a rounded smoothness by countless hours of contact with silt and salt. They are not sharp, not designed to cut, but rather to stir and gather, to move through the bottom layer with a gentle insistence that breaks up the crust without damaging the pan floor beneath. You lower the rake into the water slowly, letting the tines enter at a shallow angle so that they slide beneath the surface without splashing, and you watch them descend through the clear brine until they hover just above the white crust. There is a moment of suspension here, a pause that lasts perhaps 2 heartbeats, in which the rake and the salt seem to be aware of each other, and then you let the tines touch down with a pressure so light that at first they barely disturb the crystals at all. The contact produces a faint sound, a sound like the crushing of dry leaves heard from a great distance, and immediately a tiny cloud of white particles rises around the tines and begins to drift sideways in the slow underwater currents. You increase the pressure gradually, feeling the crust give way beneath the wood, feeling the transition from solid to granular as the crystalline layer breaks apart and releases the softer silt below, and then you begin the first stroke. The motion is a push away from your body, a smooth extension of the arms that sends the rake sliding forward through the water with a steady, dragging resistance. The tines cut 4 parallel furrows in the crust, each one about 1 inch deep and 1 inch wide, and behind them rises a plume of disturbed salt that billows upward like smoke from a slow fire. The water around the tines turns milky white, the clarity of the brine replaced by a swirling opacity that hides the bottom completely, and the sound of the rake changes as it moves, becomes a continuous soft grinding, the sound of thousands of tiny cubic crystals scraping against each other and against the wet wood. It is a sound that you feel in your hands as much as you hear it, a vibration that travels up the handle and into the bones of your forearms. And it is a sound that has become so familiar over the years that it no longer registers as noise. It is simply the texture of the work, the audible shape of a task being done. You complete the first stroke and pause, letting the rake rest on the bottom while the cloud of salt begins to settle. The larger crystals fall first, sinking back to the silt in a slow, glittering rain, while the finer particles remain suspended longer, drifting in the gentle currents and catching the sunlight in a million tiny flashes. The effect is like watching a handful of crushed glass dropped into clear water, a brief underwater snowstorm that slowly resolves itself back into transparency. You wait until you can see the furrows you have made, 4 pale lines across the darker silt, and then you step forward and begin the next stroke, pulling the rake towards you this time with a motion that engages the muscles of your back and shoulders in a slightly different way. The pull stroke requires a little more strength than the push, because you are working against the natural angle of the tines, and you feel the effort settle into the space between your shoulder blades, a warm, dull ache that is not unpleasant, but simply present, like the weight of the sun on your neck. As you pull, the tines gather the loosened salt into a low ridge that builds up in front of the rake, a miniature dune of white crystals that grows with each inch of movement. When the stroke is complete, you lift the rake slightly, allowing the ridge to remain behind while you reposition for the next push, and the ridge sits on the bottom like a tiny mountain range, its peaks just barely breaking the surface of the brine and glinting in the morning light. You settle into the rhythm now, the rhythm that is the heart of the day's work. Push and pause, pull and pause, step forward, push again. Each stroke overlaps the previous one by half the width of the rake, so that no strip of crust is left untouched. And as you move across the pan, you leave behind you a pattern of alternating furrows and ridges that is as regular as the weave of a basket. The pattern is not something you think about consciously. Your hands know how to space the strokes, how much to overlap, how to adjust the angle when you near the edge of the pan so that the rake follows the line of the bank without gouging into the clay. It is knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind, a kind of physical memory that has been built up over season after season of standing in shallow water under the summer sun. The sun itself is a constant presence now, a steady pressure of heat on your shoulders and the back of your neck. You are wearing a wide-brimmed hat woven from marsh reeds, and it casts a circle of shade that moves with you as you work, covering your face and the upper part of your chest in a coolness that makes the heat on your arms feel bearable. The hat is old and frayed at the edges, the reeds bleached by many summers to a pale straw color, and it has a particular smell when it gets wet, a smell of dry grass and faint mildew that is not unpleasant, but simply familiar, the smell of a thing that has done its job for a long time. The brim dips slightly every time you lean forward to push the rake, and you have learned to tilt your head at just the right angle to keep the water in front of you visible without letting the sun strike your eyes. The work continues, stroke after stroke, and as your body settles deeper into the rhythm, your mind begins to loosen, to drift away from the immediate task and wander across the wider landscape of the marsh. You notice things without really noticing them, the way the light plays on the ripples that your movements create, the way a dragonfly hovers motionless for a long second before darting sideways, the way the distant line of the sea is a slightly darker blue than the sky above it. These observations float through your awareness like the salt crystals in the water, appearing and then dissolving, leaving no trace except a general sense of calm attentiveness. The soundscape of the marsh wraps around you as you work, a layer of quiet noise that is always present but never intrusive. The wind pump creaks on, its rhythm as steady as your own, and somewhere behind you in the larger pans a flock of gulls has settled on the water and is making its usual argument of high, sharp cries. The sound carries cleanly across the flat landscape, the notes arriving one by one and then fading into the soft hum of insects that fills the air between the bird calls. The insects themselves are mostly invisible, tiny flies and midges that dance in columns above the warmer patches of water, but their collective drone is a constant, a low frequency that seems to vibrate in the air itself rather than coming from any particular source. You reach the end of the pan and turn, facing back the way you came. And for a moment you pause to look at the work you have done so far. The half of the pan behind you is a map of your morning's labor, the surface broken into a neat pattern of lines, the water still cloudy with suspended salt but beginning to clear at the edges where the current is weakest. The half of the pan ahead of you is still untouched, its surface glassy and perfect, the white crust visible through the brine like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The contrast between the two halves is striking, order and potential lying side by side in the same rectangle of water, and you feel a quiet satisfaction at the sight, the simple pleasure of seeing a task half completed and knowing exactly how the rest of it will go. You begin the return journey, pushing the rake ahead of you into the undisturbed crust, and the work resumes its steady pattern. Now, however, you are working towards the bank where you left your basket and your water bottle, and as you move, you become aware of a slight thirst beginning to make itself known at the back of your throat. It is not an urgent thirst, not the kind that demands immediate attention, but a gentle reminder that you have been working for some time and that the sun is drawing moisture from your body almost as efficiently as it draws it from the pans. You decide that you will drink when you finish this pan, and the decision settles into the back of your mind where it can wait without distracting you from the rhythm of the rake. The salt crust in this half of the pan is slightly different from the first half, a little thinner near the bank and a little thicker towards the center where the water is shallowest, and you adjust your pressure automatically, bearing down a fraction more in the deep parts and lightening your touch as you near the edge. This is the kind of small variation that makes the work interesting without making it difficult, a subtlety that keeps the hands engaged while the mind is free to roam. You think about the rest of the day ahead, the second raking that will come in the afternoon when the crust has rebuilt itself, the gathering and carrying, the final check of the sluices at dusk. The thoughts are not plans exactly, not a list of tasks to be accomplished, but more like a gentle preview of the hours to come, a quiet acknowledgement that the day has a shape and that you are moving through it at the pace it requires. The last stroke of the pan brings you to the bank where you started, and you lift the rake from the water with a small cascade of drips that sparkle in the sunlight before falling back into the brine. The tines emerge clean and wet, the wood darkened to a deep amber by its immersion, and you set the rake aside with its head resting on the bank and its handle pointing up towards the sky. The water in the pan behind you is uniformly cloudy now, a soft luminous white that will take some time to settle, and you know that when it does the crust will be gone and the tiny crystals will be suspended in the brine, ready to grow larger and more numerous as the sun continues its work. You climb out of the pan and sit down on the bank, your legs dripping, your feet leaving wet prints on the worn clay that will dry to faint white outlines within minutes. The clay bottle of water is in your basket, still cool from being wrapped in its damp cloth, and you pull out the wooden stopper and drink slowly, feeling the water travel down your throat and spread through your chest in a wave of pleasant coolness. The bread and cheese are there too, but you are not hungry yet. That will come later, at midday, when the sun is at its highest and the work has stored up a proper appetite in your belly. For now, the water is enough, and you sit in the shade of your hat and look out across the marsh, watching the heat haze begin to shimmer above the larger pans and listening to the quiet sounds of a world that is in no hurry at all. The first raking is finished and the pans behind you are settling into their morning stillness, the clouds of disturbed salt slowly sinking through the clear brine towards the silt floor where they will rest and grow for a few hours before the afternoon harvest. You sit on the raised bank between the pans with your clay bottle of water in your hand and your hat tilted back slightly, and you let the quiet of the marsh settle around you like a second skin. There is no hurry now, no immediate task calling for your hands, and this interval between the raking and the gathering is one of the oldest rhythms of the saltern, a pause built into the day as surely as the pans are built into the earth. It is the time for watching, for measuring, for attending to the invisible work that the sun is doing while you rest. The sun is well up now, no longer low and golden, but climbing towards its midday whiteness, and the heat is beginning to gather in earnest. You can feel it on the clay beneath your legs, a stored warmth that radiates upward through the packed earth, and you can see it in the way the air above the larger pans has begun to shimmer, a faint rippling distortion that makes the distant wind pump seem to waver slightly as it turns. This shimmer is the visible sign of evaporation, the water rising into the air in quantities too vast to measure but too small to see, and it is the fundamental process upon which the entire saltern depends. Without it, the brine would remain brine forever, and the salt would never crystallize, and the long chain of ponds from the sea to the drying pans would be nothing more than a series of shallow puddles. You understand evaporation not as a scientific principle, but as a daily companion, a presence that you have worked alongside since you were old enough to walk the banks. You know how it behaves in different weathers, how a dry wind will strip water from the pans faster than a still day, how a hot sun with high thin clouds will work more slowly than a clear blue sky, how the cool of night nearly stops the process altogether. You know that the evaporation is strongest in the early afternoon, that it slows as the sun declines, and that in the darkness the brine actually gives back a little of its heat to the air and seems to rest, holding its concentration steady until the next day's sun can resume the work. This knowledge is not written down anywhere. It lives in the bodies of the salt workers, passed from one pair of hands to the next through the simple act of doing the work together. Now, in this interval between the morning's first task and the afternoon's harvest, you turn your attention to the brine itself, not as a medium through which you move, but as a substance with its own qualities and behaviors that need to be read and understood. Each pan is slightly different, and the difference is matter, and part of your skill lies in knowing how to read the water, as another person might read a page of writing. You rise from the bank and walk slowly along its length, your bare feet silent on the warm clay, and you stop at intervals to look down into the pans and assess what you see. The first thing you look for is the color of the brine. When seawater first enters the reservoir, it is a dark grey-green, the color of the open solent on a cloudy day, and it holds within it all the suspended life of the sea, tiny shrimps and larval fish, fragments of seaweed, the microscopic creatures that cloud the water and give it body. As the water moves through the chain of ponds and loses volume to evaporation, it also loses this life, the creatures dying as the salinity increases beyond what they can tolerate and their tiny bodies settling to the bottom or being eaten by the birds that patrol the pans. By the time the brine reaches the middle ponds, it is a clear amber green, the color of weak tea held up to the light, and it is utterly lifeless except for a few hardy organisms that can survive in water that is 3 or 4 times saltier than the sea. And by the time it reaches your crystallization pans, the brine has become something else entirely, a clear, pale, almost colorless liquid with the faintest tinge of rose or lavender when the light strikes it from the side, a color so subtle that it is more like a quality of the light itself than a property of the water. This lavender blush is what you are looking for this morning, and you find it in varying degrees as you walk from pan to pan. In the pan closest to the reservoir, the one that receives the freshest inflow, the blush is barely visible, just a hint of pink at the edges where the water is shallowest and the evaporation has been most intense. In the middle pans, the color is stronger, a definite rosy tint that makes the water look almost warm to the touch. And in the farthest pan, the one you have not yet worked today, the brine has deepened to a pale amethyst, and this tells you that it is nearly ready for its first harvest, that another day or two of this dry summer weather will bring it to the perfect point of saturation where the salt will begin to crystallize in earnest. The color comes from tiny organisms that thrive in the concentrated brine, a kind of algae or perhaps a bacterium that colors the water much as life colors everything it inhabits. You do not know the name of this organism and do not need to know it. You know only that its presence is a reliable indicator of the brine's strength, a paint stroke on the water that tells you what the water itself cannot say. When the lavender is pale, the brine is still a day or two from readiness. When the lavender deepens to a rich purple, the brine is fully saturated and will produce a heavy crop of salt, and when the color begins to fade again to a rusty orange, the brine is exhausted, its dissolved salt mostly precipitated out, and it is time to drain the pan and let in fresh concentrated brine from the middle ponds. You stop at the edge of the amethyst pan and kneel down on the bank, leaning over so that your face is close to the surface, and you study the water with the kind of attention that can only come from years of practice. The brine is perfectly still, its surface a sheet of glass that reflects the sky with such fidelity that you can see individual clouds mirrored in it, small white puffs that drift slowly across the rectangular frame of the pan. Beneath the surface, the bottom is clearly visible, the smooth silt floor dotted here and there with the first tiny crystals that have begun to form spontaneously. A dusting of translucent cubes that will multiply rapidly once the brine reaches full saturation. There is no crust yet on this pan, no white film to be broken, and that tells you that your timing is right, that the brine is almost but not quite ready for the rake. You lower your hand into the water, doing it slowly so as not to disturb the surface more than necessary, and you let the brine close over your fingers while you feel for the qualities that color cannot convey. The first thing you notice is the density, the way the water resists your hand with a slight gummy thickness that is quite different from the thin, easy feel of fresh water or even ordinary seawater. When you move your fingers through the brine, they leave trails that persist for a moment before healing, the liquid closing behind them with a slowness that is almost oily. This density is the accumulated weight of dissolved salt, the invisible load that the water has been carrying and concentrating through all its long journey from the sea, and it tells you that the brine is strong and getting stronger. You withdraw your hand and watch the brine bead on your skin, forming drops that are rounder and more perfect than ordinary water droplets because the surface tension is higher. The drops cling to your fingers for a moment, heavy and slow, and then they fall back into the pan with a sound that is more like a soft plop than the light splash of fresh water. The brine that remains on your skin begins to dry almost immediately in the warm air, leaving a faint white bloom of salt that feels slightly powdery when you rub your thumb across it. You lift your fingers to your tongue and touch the tip of one to the drying salt, and the taste is so intense that it is almost painful. A sharp electric shock of saltiness that floods your mouth and makes you reach for your water bottle to wash it away. This is the final test, the one that confirms what your eyes and your skin have already told you. The brine is strong, the day is dry, and the harvest will be good. You rise from your kneeling position and continue your walk along the banks, ruling now towards the sluice boards that control the flow of water between the middle pans and the crystallization pans. These boards are simple rectangles of oak, about the width of your hand and as thick as 3 fingers. And they are fitted into slots that have been cut into the clay walls at the precise height where the water should flow. When a board is fully in place, it blocks the slot completely, and no water can pass. When it is lifted slightly, a thin sheet of brine slides over the top of the board and falls into the next pan with a gentle trickling sound. When it is removed entirely, the slot becomes an open channel and the water rushes through with surprising speed, eager to find its own level. The boards are heavy with moisture and dark with age, the oak having been stained almost black by years of immersion in salt water, and their surfaces are wrinkled with a pattern of fine cracks that follow the grain of the wood. The slots they fit into are lined with a thick paste of clay and chopped reeds that has been pressed into every gap to make the seal watertight, and this paste must be renewed every season because the winter rains wash it away and the summer sun bakes it into dust. You check each board as you come to it, testing its fit with a slight push of your hand, making sure that it is not leaking more than a trickle into the pan below. A small leak is acceptable and even desirable because it keeps the brine moving slowly through the system. A large leak would upset the balance and dilute the crystallization pans before their time. At the third sluice, you stop and consider the board for a long moment, reading the story that the water tells as it seeps through the narrow gap between the wood and the clay. The seepage is a little heavier here than it should be, a steady dribble rather than the occasional drop, and you decide to adjust the board, pushing it down more firmly into its slot so that the gap closes slightly. You do this by placing the heel of your hand on the top edge of the board and pressing downward with a steady, even pressure, and the board moves perhaps 1/4 of an inch, scraping against the clay with a wet, gritty sound before it seats itself more tightly and the dribble reduces to a slow drip. This small adjustment will have an effect that ripples through the system over the course of the day, slowing the inflow to the crystallization pan and giving the brine a little more time to concentrate in the middle ponds. It is a tiny alteration, almost imperceptible in the moment, but it is the kind of attention that makes the difference between a good harvest and a poor one. You move on to the next sluice and the next, making similar small adjustments where they are needed, and as you work you fall into the same kind of quiet rhythm that the raking produces, a slow walking meditation that takes you the length of the saltern and back. The sun climbs higher, the heat builds, The shimmer above the pans intensifies, and all around you the great invisible engine of evaporation continues its silent labor, lifting water into the sky molecule by molecule and leaving the salt behind to grow heavier and denser in the shallow basins. The birds have fallen quiet now in the midday warmth, and even the insects seem to have slowed their buzzing, as if the whole marsh is holding its breath and waiting for the cool of evening. By the time you return to your starting point, the brine in your pans has cleared completely from the morning's disturbance, and you can see the bottom again with perfect clarity. The crust has not yet reformed, but you can see the beginning of it in the faint white haze that is gathering along the edges where the water is shallowest, and you know that by early afternoon it will be thick enough for the second raking. The day is unfolding exactly as it should, the brine concentrating, the salt forming, the work waiting for you with the patience of a thing that has been done the same way for 1,000 years, and you settle back onto the bank in the small shade of your hat and let the rest of the morning drift past you like a cloud across the sun. The sun has reached the highest part of its arc now, and the marsh lies under it in a state of suspended stillness that feels almost like the landscape is holding its breath. The shadows that were so long and cool in the early morning have contracted into narrow pools of darkness at the bases of the banks, and even these are warm when you put your hand into them, the clay having absorbed so much heat that it radiates it back out again like a baker's oven long after the fire has been drawn. The light is no longer golden or even white, but a kind of pale brass, a color that seems to press down on everything with a gentle weight, and the air is so full of heat that it feels thick in your lungs when you breathe. You have retreated to the small patch of shade that falls on the leeward side of the wind pump, the only vertical structure for some distance, and you have made yourself a seat on a low wooden crate that someone left there long ago and that no one has ever bothered to move. The crate is weathered to a silvery grey and its edges are soft with rot, but it holds your weight without complaint, and it places you at just the right height to see out across the pans while keeping your head below the level of the bank, where the breeze, such as it is, can find you. The breeze today is a very small thing, barely enough to turn the great slatted wheel above you, but what there is of it comes from the sea and carries with it a faint coolness that makes the shade feel like a different country from the sun-baked clay just a few feet away. The wind pump above you creaks with every revolution, a sound so steady and so old that it has become less a noise and more a kind of silence, a background against which the other sounds of the marsh arrange themselves. The wheel is perhaps 15 feet across, its slats angled to catch the prevailing southwesterly that blows up the Solent, and as it turns it drives a simple wooden piston that lifts water from the drainage channels and sends it back into the reservoir, a small contribution to the endless circulation that keeps the saltern alive. The mechanism is simple enough that you could draw it in the dust with a stick, a crank, a connecting rod, a leather valve that opens and closes with each stroke, and the whole thing held together with wooden pegs and iron nails that have rusted to a deep orange brown. You have helped to repair it more than once, replacing a cracked slat or greasing the leather with tallow, and you know every part of it the way you know the parts of your own rake. From your seat in the shade, you can see the whole spread of the saltern laid out before you, and in the midday heat it has taken on a quality that is almost like a painting. The colors all washed out to pale blues and soft browns, and the distant line of the sea, a mere suggestion of darker blue at the edge of the sky. The larger pans to the east are a sheet of hammered silver, their surfaces still stirred by the faint breeze into a pattern of ripples that catch the sunlight and scatter it in 1,000 directions at once, so that looking at them for more than a few seconds makes your eyes ache and you have to look away. The middle pans are calmer, their denser brine resisting the wind, and they reflect the sky with a stillness that is almost perfect, broken only by the occasional passage of a bird's shadow or the expanding rings where an insect has touched down. And your own crystallization pans, the ones you worked this morning, are now completely clear again. They're water-glassy and still, the white crust beginning to reform along the edges in a thin, delicate line that sparkles even from this distance. The heat at this hour has a sound of its own, or rather it produces sounds in the things it touches, and these sounds are different from the sounds of morning. The insects are the loudest now, a continuous dry buzzing that rises from the marsh grass in waves, swelling and fading and swelling again as if the heat itself were breathing through 1,000 tiny bodies. Grasshoppers and crickets mostly, Their stridulations are high, thin whine that seems to come from everywhere at once, plus the deeper drone of bees working the sea lavender that grows in purple clumps along the banks. The birds have fallen almost completely silent, the curlew and the redshank and the little sandpipers all having retreated to whatever patches of shade they can find, and the only bird sound now is the occasional sharp cry of a gull passing high overhead, a sound that seems to tear a small hole in the heat before closing up again. The mud in the channels between the pans is drying rapidly, its surface cracking into the familiar hexagonal plates that curl up at the edges like shallow saucers, and as it dries it makes a faint ticking sound, a sound like the embers of a fire settling. This ticking is so quiet that you can only hear it when the insects pause and the wind pump creaks into its slowest phase, and it is one of those sounds that you would never notice unless you were sitting still in the shade with nothing else to occupy your attention. There is another sound too, even fainter, that comes from the pans themselves, the tiny crisp popping of salt crystals forming at the very edge of the brine, a sound like the crackle of distant cellophane that is really just the crystalline bonds snapping into place as the last water molecules flee into the air. You have heard this sound so many times that you no longer hear it consciously, but it is there, the audible signature of the work that the sun is doing. Your midday meal is spread out on the crate beside you, the linen cloth opened flat to make a small clean surface, and you eat slowly because there is no reason to eat quickly. The bread is coarse and dark, made from rye flour ground at the mill on the river, and it has a dense, chewy texture that requires you to work at it with your teeth, which is satisfying in a quiet way. The cheese is hard and pale yellow, made from sheep's milk on one of the farms that lie inland beyond the marsh, and it has a sharp, salty taste that goes well with the bread's earthy sweetness. There is also a small wrinkled apple from last autumn's harvest, its skin soft and its flesh slightly floury but still sweet, and you eat it last, saving the sweetness for the end, the way you have always done. The water from your clay bottle is no longer cool, but it is still wet, and you drink it in small sips, letting each mouthful rest for a moment before you swallow. Eating alone in the shade of the wind pump, with the whole marsh spread out before you and the heat pressing down on everything like a gentle hand, you feel a kind of peace that is specific to this time and this place. It is not excitement or happiness exactly, not anything so sharp, but a quiet contentment that comes from having done good work in the morning and knowing that more work waits in the afternoon, that the day has a shape, and you are moving through it at the pace it wants to be moved through. There is no clock in the saltern except the sun, no schedule except the slow chemistry of the brine, and you have learned over many seasons to let your body follow these rhythms rather than any abstract measure of hours and minutes. The heat makes your thoughts move slowly, and you let them drift where they will, without trying to direct them. You think about the village that lies a mile inland, the cluster of low cottages with their thatched roofs and their gardens of herbs and cabbages, and you think about the coolness that will gather there in the evening when the sun drops behind the ridge and the shadows stretch out across the lane. You think about the tide that is turning now, somewhere out in the Solent, the great body of water beginning its slow return towards the shore, and you calculate without really calculating that it will reach the creek mouth around dusk, that the sluice gate will need to be checked before then. You think about the salt that is forming in the pans behind you, crystal by crystal, layer by layer, and you think about the basket that will be heavy with it by the end of the day. And these thoughts are all pleasant in the way that familiar things are pleasant, requiring no effort and producing no worry. The wind pump creaks, the insects buzz, the mud ticks, the salt crackles, and the whole marsh rests under the midday sun in a state of suspended animation that is broken only by the very small movements of very small things. A dragonfly lands on the edge of the nearest pan, its wings catching the light in a flash of iridescent blue, and it rests there for a moment before darting away so fast that your eye cannot follow it. A butterfly, a small brown one with orange tips on its wings, flutters along the bank and pauses on a stem of sea lavender, opening and closing its wings slowly as if it were breathing. A water beetle rows itself across the surface of one of the middle pans, its legs making tiny dimples in the surface film, and behind it the dimples heal over instantly, as if the beetle had never been there at all. You watch these small events with the kind of attention that only stillness can produce, an attention that is not focused or sharp but wide and soft, taking in everything at once without grasping at any one thing. It is the kind of looking that you do when you are not really looking, when your eyes are open but your mind is somewhere else entirely, and it is restful in a way that sleep itself is restful. The heat wraps around you like a blanket, and for a few minutes you let your eyes close, not sleeping but drifting, aware of the sounds around you but not attending to them. Your body still and your breathing slow. When you open your eyes again, the sun has moved perceptibly, the shadow of the wind pump having shifted a few inches across the clay, and you know that the interval of rest is coming to its natural end. The heat is beginning its slow decline from the peak, the light beginning its long slide towards the golden tones of late afternoon. And somewhere in the pans behind you, the salt crust is thickening, rebuilding itself from the brine that the sun is still working on. You fold the linen cloth around the remains of your meal and tuck it back into the basket, and you take one last sip of water before stoppering the clay bottle and setting it aside. The rake is still leaning against the wind pump where you left it. Its tines dry now and white with a faint crust of salt, and you pick it up and feel the familiar weight settle into your hands. The afternoon work will begin soon, the second raking and the gathering and the carrying, but for now you stand for just a moment longer in the shrinking shade, looking out across the marsh that glitters and shimmers and ticks and creaks under the great dome of the summer sky. The sea is a thin blue line on the horizon, the clouds are small and white and motionless, and the salt is forming grain by grain in the shallow pans, patient and invisible and utterly without hurry. You step out of the shade and feel the sun fall on your shoulders like a warm hand, and you begin to walk back along the bank towards the crystallization pans, your rake on your shoulder and your shadow walking beside you on the water. The afternoon is well advanced when you step back into the first of your crystallization pans, and the heat that was so heavy at midday has softened into something gentler, a warm golden weight that presses down without pressing too hard. The sun has moved far enough to the west that the light falls on the water at a different angle now, lower and more slanting, and this new angle reveals things that the high noonlight concealed. The crust that has rebuilt itself since morning is thicker than it was at dawn, thick enough that you can see its texture from several feet away, a white granular skin that covers the silt floor in a continuous sheet broken only by the faint parallel grooves left by your earlier raking. The grooves are still visible because the crust has formed within them as well as on the raised ridges between them, but it is thinner in the grooves and thicker on the ridges, and this variation gives the whole bottom a striped appearance, like the sand on a beach when the tide has just retreated. You stand at the edge of the pan and look down through the clear brine, studying the crust with the same attention you gave to the brine's color earlier in the day. The crystals are no longer the fine dusting they were at dawn. They have grown in the hours since, fed by the continuous evaporation and the warmth of the afternoon, and they are now distinct individual grains that you can pick out with your naked eye. Each grain is a tiny cube or nearly a cube, with flat sides and sharp edges and corners that catch the light and throw it back in small white sparks. The cubes are not all the same size. Some are as small as grains of sand and some are as large as the seeds of an apple, and they lie jumbled together in a random pattern that nevertheless has a kind of order to it, an order imposed by the crystal structure itself, the sodium and chloride ions arranging themselves in their eternal cubic lattice. If you were to reach down and pick up a single crystal and hold it on the tip of your finger, which you have done many times out of simple curiosity, you would see that it is not perfectly clear like glass, but slightly milky, slightly translucent, with tiny flaws and inclusions that catch the light and scatter it. The inclusions are mostly other minerals that were dissolved in the seawater, along with the salt, traces of magnesium and calcium and potassium that the evaporation has concentrated, along with the sodium chloride, and they give the crystal a faint bluish or pinkish cast, depending on which minerals predominate in that particular pan. The salt from the eastern pans always has a slight pink tint, while the salt from the western pans is a pure clean white, and the buyers in Lymington know this and pay accordingly, the pink being prized for certain uses and the white for others. But you are not thinking about buyers and prices now. You are thinking about the work, about the second raking of the day, which is the main harvest, the gathering of the salt that the morning stirring and the afternoon's heat have produced. You step down into the pan, feeling the bottom under your bare feet, and the crust gives way beneath your weight with a soft crunching sensation. the crystals grinding against each other and against the silt, the sound traveling up through the water and into your legs. The brine is warmer now than it was this morning, having soaked up the sun's heat all day, and it feels almost pleasant as it closes over your calves and knees, neither cool nor hot, but exactly the temperature of the summer air. You position yourself near the center of the pan, where the crust is thickest, and you lift the rake and lower it into the water with the same slow care you used this morning. The tines touch down on the crust, and the sensation is different now, the resistance greater, the hard crystalline layer pushing back against the wood before it yields. You bear down a little harder, increasing the pressure until you feel the crust crack and break, the tines sinking through the white layer and into the softer silt below, and then you begin the stroke. The motion for the second raking is a pull rather than a push, because you are not just breaking the crust now, but gathering it, drawing the loosened crystals towards you in a long, low ridge that will later be lifted into the basket. You lean back slightly, shifting your weight onto your heels, and you pull the rake towards your body with a smooth, steady motion that engages the muscles of your arms and shoulders and back all at once. The tines move through the water, cutting 4 parallel furrows in the crust, and behind them rises a much denser cloud of salt than this morning's work produced. A thick white plume that billows upward and outward and turns the water round your legs completely opaque. The sound is louder too, a deeper grinding crunch as the larger crystals scrape against the wood, and the vibration that travels up the handle is stronger, a rough buzzing that you feel in your palms and wrists. You complete the stroke and pause, letting the rake rest while you look at the ridge that has formed. It is a low white mound that sits on the bottom just behind your feet, a miniature dune of salt crystals that sparkles through the cloudy water with an intense, clean brilliance. The ridge is perhaps 6 inches wide and rises 3 or 4 inches above the silt, and its surface is rough and irregular, made of thousands of individual crystals that have been piled together by the passage of the rake. Even as you watch, the ridge begins to settle slightly, the crystals shifting and packing down under their own weight, and small avalanches of salt grains slide down its sides and spread out across the silt. You step sideways now, positioning yourself for the next stroke, and you pull the rake again, drawing another ridge of salt parallel to the first. The 2 ridges lie side by side, like the furrows of a ploughed field in miniature, and the space between them is clean dark silt from which the crust has been entirely removed. As you continue to work, you will fill the whole pan with these ridges, a pattern of white lines across the dark bottom. And when you are done, the pan will look like a tiny landscape of snowy hills and dark valleys, a geography of salt that you have created. Stroke by stroke, the work settles into its rhythm, the same rhythm as the morning, but with a different quality, a heavier, more deliberate pace that reflects the greater weight of the material you are moving. Each pull of the rake requires a moment of effort, a brief engagement of strength, but it is not tiring in the way that hurried work is tiring. It is a slow, steady expenditure of energy that leaves you feeling warm and loose rather than exhausted. Your breathing has deepened, your heart beating a little faster than it did at rest, but not much, and you can feel the blood moving through your body in a pleasant way, carrying oxygen to the muscles that need it. As you work, you pay attention to the crystals themselves, noticing the way they behave differently at this stage of their growth. The morning salt was a delicate frost that dissolved almost instantly when you disturbed it. The afternoon salt is robust, the cubes fully formed and hard, and they do not dissolve when you rake them, but simply pile up, waiting to be collected. This is the difference that a few hours of evaporation and warmth can make, the transformation from a fragile beginning to a sturdy middle, and it is one of the many slow changes that the saltern teaches you to observe and appreciate. The crust in the afternoon also shows signs of the layered growth that has occurred since morning. When you look closely at the ridge you have pulled, you can sometimes see that the crystals at the bottom are slightly smaller than the crystals at the top, because the ones at the bottom formed earlier in the day when the brine was less concentrated, while the ones at the top formed later when the evaporation had driven the concentration higher. There is also a thin line of slightly darker salt that runs through the middle of the thicker crust patches, a line that marks the pause in evaporation that occurs at the hottest part of midday, when the air becomes so saturated with moisture that it cannot easily accept more, a brief plateau in the otherwise steady upward climb of the salt's formation. You work your way across the pan, pulling ridge after ridge, and as you move, the water behind you grows steadily more cloudy until it is a uniform soft white that hides the bottom completely. The water ahead of you remains clear, and you can see the undisturbed crust waiting, its surface smooth and unbroken, and the contrast between the worked and unworked halves of the pan is the same contrast you saw this morning, but intensified, the ridges here being larger and more numerous, the transformation more dramatic. The sun continues its slow descent, and the light continues to warm from white to gold, and the shadows of the banks begin to stretch out across the water again, long rectangles of cool blue that move slowly eastward as the afternoon progresses. The birds that were silent at midday have begun to stir again, a few tentative calls sounding from the marsh grass, and the insects have shifted their pitch, the buzzing now lower and more intermittent than it was at the peak of the heat. A light breeze has sprung up from the sea, barely strong enough to ripple the surface of the larger pans, and it carries with it a fresh salt smell that is different from the smell of the pans, the smell of open water and distance. You reach the end of the pan and turn, facing back towards the bank where your basket waits, and you begin the return journey, pulling the last rows of salt towards you. The pan is nearly full of ridges now, a whole miniature mountain range of salt that lies under the cloudy water like a treasure waiting to be lifted. The final strokes bring you to the edge of the pan, and you climb out onto the bank and stand there for a moment, looking at what you have done. The water is too cloudy to see through, but you know what lies beneath it, and the knowledge is satisfying in a quiet way, the satisfying in a task completed with care and without hurry. You set the rake aside and pick up the flat wooden scoop that has been waiting in your basket all day. The scoop is a simple tool, a rectangle of oak about the size of a small book, with a handle carved from the same piece of wood and a blunt edge that slides easily under the salt ridges without digging into the silt. You test its weight in your hand, finding the balance point, and then you step back down into the pan, the water now so cloudy that you cannot see your own feet, and you begin the work of gathering the harvest. The water in the pan is still cloudy from the raking, a soft luminous white that hides the bottom completely, and as you step back into it, you must trust your feet to find the ridges you have just made. The first ridge is exactly where you left it, a low firm mound of salt that presses up against the sole of your foot with a granular crunch, and you position yourself beside it with the wooden scoop in your right hand and the basket waiting on the bank behind you. The scoop is a simple tool, but a good one, its blade worn thin at the edge from years of sliding under salt, its handle smooth to a dark polish by the grip of your palm, and it fits your hand in a way that makes it feel less like a tool and more like an extension of your arm. You bend at the waist, keeping your back straight as you have learned to do over many seasons, and you lower the scoop into the water slowly, letting it slide down through the cloudy brine until the leading edge touches the silt just beside the ridge. The motion is careful and deliberate because you do not want to dig into the silt and mix mud with the clean salt. The edge must skim along the boundary between the two, separating the white crystals from the dark clay with the precision of a knife peeling the skin from a fruit. You push the scoop forward gently, feeling the resistance change as it enters the base of the ridge, a slight thickening of the medium through which the blade must travel, and then with a smooth upward tilt of your wrist, you lift the first load of salt free from the bottom. The scoop comes up through the water with a soft rushing sound, and as it breaks the surface, the brine cascades off the sides in a sparkling curtain of droplets that fall back into the pan with a sound like light rain. What remains on the flat wooden blade is a heap of wet salt crystals, their cubic shapes clearly visible now that they are out of the water, their surfaces glinting and flashing as they catch the late afternoon sun. The salt is heavy in a way that dry salt is not heavy, each crystal still carrying its coating of dense brine, and the whole load has a wet, slurried texture that holds together in a mass rather than running off the scoop like dry grains would. You turn carefully, balancing the loaded scoop in front of you, and you wade through the cloudy water towards the bank where the basket sits. The water resists your movement slightly, the dense brine thicker than ordinary water, and each step makes a low sloshing sound that is muffled by the soft silt bottom. When you reach the bank, you lift the scoop clear of the water and tip it forward, letting the wet salt slide off the wood and into the waiting basket with a heavy wet pat. The salt lands on the wicker bottom and spreads out in a white mound that immediately begins to glisten as the brine drains away through the gaps in the weave, leaving the crystals behind, a little drier and a little brighter with each passing second. You turn back to the pan and wade out to the next section of the ridge, the scoop still dripping, your feet finding the familiar contours of the bottom, even though you cannot see them. The ridge continues in a long straight line across the pan, and you work your way along it in sections, sliding the scoop under the salt, lifting it clear, carrying it to the bank, tipping it into the basket, turning back for more. The rhythm of this work is different from the rhythm of the raking. It is more varied, more broken into distinct actions, but it has its own steady pattern that quickly becomes as comfortable as breathing. Slide, lift, carry, tip, return, slide, lift, carry, tip, return, slide, lift, carry, tip, return. The basket fills slowly, the salt piling up in a damp white cone that grows higher with each trip. When the salt reaches the rim of the basket, you pause and use your hands to press it down gently, compressing the crystals so that more will fit, and the salt yields under your palms with a soft crunching sensation, the sound of thousands of tiny cubes settling into a tighter arrangement. The pressing releases more brine, which trickles out through the bottom of the basket and runs in a thin stream down the clay bank and back into the pan, a small return of water to the place it came from. As you work, the late afternoon light continues to change around you, the gold deepening towards amber, the shadows stretching longer across the marsh. The sun is now low enough that it shines almost horizontally across the pans, and the light that reaches you is filtered through the low haze that always gathers over the marsh in the late afternoon, a haze made of evaporated brine and dust and the breath of the sea. The haze softens everything, blurs the edges of the banks, turns the distant wind pump into a dark silhouette against a sky that is shading from pale blue to a soft, warm rose near the horizon. The birds have become active again after their midday quiet, and their calls form a gentle chorus that accompanies your work. A curlew pipes its long bubbling note from somewhere in the marsh grass, and another answers it from further away, and the two calls weave around each other in a pattern that is never quite the same twice. A flock of small sandpipers wheels over the larger pans, their white bellies flashing as they turn in unison, and their wing beats make a soft whirring sound that reaches you a moment after they have passed. A heron lifts itself heavily from the shallows and flaps slowly away towards the sea, its long legs trailing behind it, each wing beat deliberate and unhurried. You empty the last of the first ridge into the basket and stand for a moment in the water, letting your arms rest, feeling the pleasant tiredness that has settled into your shoulders and the small of your back. The tiredness is not exhaustion, not the deep ache that comes from work that is too heavy or too long. It is a milder thing, a gentle reminder that you have used your body well today, that the muscles have done what they were asked to do and are now ready to rest. You stretch your arms above your head and feel the pull across your chest and the release in your spine. And then you bend back to the work. The second ridge is a little shorter than the first because it lies closer to the edge of the pan, and you clear it in fewer trips, the scoop sliding under the salt with the same smooth motion, the basket receiving load after load. The salt from this ridge is slightly different from the first, a little whiter and a little finer, because the crust was thinner near the bank where the water was shallower and the evaporation more intense. You notice this difference without commenting on it, the way you notice the difference between one cloud and another, and you adjust the angle of the scoop slightly to account for the finer grain, taking a little less with each pass so that the load is easier to control. The third ridge takes you deeper into the pan again, and here the salt is thicker and coarser, the crystals having grown larger in the slightly deeper water where the temperature was more stable through the heat of the day. The scoop bites into the ridge with a satisfying crunch, and the loads are heavier, requiring more effort to lift and carry, but the effort is still well within the range of what feels comfortable, what feels right. Your body knows how much it can carry, and you do not push beyond that limit, because haste serves no purpose in the saltern. The salt will wait, the sun will wait, the tide will wait. The basket is nearly full now, the salt piled high above the rim in a steep white cone that sparkles in the amber light. You wade to the bank one last time and set the scoop down beside the basket, and then you lift the basket by its two handles, testing its weight. It is heavy, as it should be. the accumulated weight of a day's worth of sun and evaporation and patient work, and you settle it against your hip with a practiced motion, finding the balance point that will let you carry it without straining. The wicker creaks softly under the load, the withies shifting and settling, and a few last drops of brine fall from the bottom and darken the clay at your feet. You carry the basket along the bank towards the drying pans, walking slowly because the load is heavy and the clay is uneven, and there is no reason to rush. The path takes you past the other crystallization pans, and you glance down into them as you pass, noting the state of their crusts and the color of their brine, filing away the information for tomorrow without consciously deciding to do so. The drying pans lie at the western edge of the saltern, a series of broad, shallow basins with clay floors that have been baked hard by the summer sun, and you choose an empty one and set the basket down beside it with a soft grunt of relief. The salt must now be spread out to dry, raked into a thin, even layer so that the last moisture can evaporate before the salt is taken to the store. You tip the basket carefully, pouring the wet salt out onto the clay in a single heavy cascade, and the crystals tumble over each other with a sound like a waterfall in miniature, a clean rushing sound that is one of the oldest sounds of the saltern. The salt forms a mound on the clay, and you pick up a different rake, one with shorter tines that is kept specifically for the drying pans, and you begin to spread the mound outward, drawing the salt into a thin white sheet that covers the clay in an even layer no thicker than your thumb. The salt immediately begins to sparkle as the last of the brine drains away, and the crystal faces catch the low golden light, and the whole drying pan seems to glow with a soft internal radiance that is beautiful in a simple, quiet way. You finish spreading the salt and stand back, the rake resting in your hand, and you look at the white sheet before you and then out across the marsh to where the sun is now touching the horizon. The day's harvest is complete, or nearly so, and the salt will dry through the evening and be ready for the store by tomorrow. You feel the same quiet satisfaction that you felt earlier, the satisfaction of work done well and without hurry, and you turn back towards your crystallization pans to begin the next part of the afternoon's routine. The small tasks that will close the day and prepare the saltern for the night. The salt store stands at the inland edge of the saltern, where the marsh begins its slow rise towards the fields and hedgerows of the village, a low timber building with a thatched roof that has weathered over many summers to a deep silver grey. It is not a large building, perhaps 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, but it is the only enclosed space on the whole marsh, and it serves as the final resting place for the salt before it is taken to market. You approach it along the raised bank with a full basket balanced against your hip, the weight of the wet salt making the wicker creak with every step. And as you draw near, you can already feel the change in the air. The way the building seems to radiate a quiet coolness that is quite different from the sun-baked clay of the pans. The door is a simple frame of oak planks hung on leather hinges, and it swings open with a soft groan when you push against it with your shoulder. The groan is a familiar sound, the sound of old wood and old leather moving together in a way they have moved 1,000 times before, and it announces your arrival to no one because there is no one inside. The interior of the store is dim after the brilliant light of the afternoon marsh, and you pause for a moment on the threshold to let your eyes adjust, the basket still heavy on your hip, the salt still dripping a slow drip onto the packed earth at your feet. As your vision clears, the interior resolves itself into a space of simple, quiet order. The floor is hard earth that has been swept and reswept so many times that it has taken on a polish almost like stone, and it slopes very slightly towards the doorway so that any water that drains from the salt will find its way out. The walls are the reverse of the outside, the timber frame visible in a grid of dark oak posts and lighter wattle panels, and between the panels the plaster has been washed with lime so that it glows faintly even in the dimness. The roof is open to the underside of the thatch, and you can see the ends of the reeds poking through the rafters. Their cut surface is pale and clean, and here and there a stray wisp of dried grass that the birds have tried to pull out for their nests. The salt inside the store is arranged in a series of low conical piles that rise from the floor like miniature white mountains, each one the harvest of a different day or a different pan. The piles are not all the same size. Some are tall and steep because the salt was still damp when it was poured and it held its shape, while others have slumped into broader, gentler shapes because the salt was drier and the crystals slid over each other more easily. The surfaces of the piles are crusted over with a thin, hard skin that forms when the salt is exposed to the slightly humid air of the store, a skin that seals the interior and keeps it dry and free-running. When you touch this skin with a finger, it cracks and collapses inward with a soft sighing sound, revealing the loose white salts beneath that sparkles even in the low light. The smell inside the store is the smell of pure dry salt, a clean, sharp scent that is quite different from the briny smell of the pans. It is a smell that fills your nose and the back of your throat and makes you think of distances, of the sea that gave this salt up, and the long, slow journey it has made from the open water to this quiet, dim room. There are other smells too, fainter ones, the dry, dusty smell of the earth floor, the faint sweetness of the thatch, the woody smell of the oak timbers, and a very slight mustiness around the bottom of the walls where the winter damp sometimes creeps in. Together, these smells make a kind of signature of the store, a particular combination that you would recognize anywhere, and they are all pleasant in the way that familiar things are pleasant. You carry your basket to the far end of the store, where there is an open space of floor, and you set it down with a soft grunt of relief, the weight lifting from your hip and shoulder. The basket sits on the earth floor with a slight tilt, the bottom having been worn uneven by many such settings down, and the salt inside it has compacted during the walk so that it now holds the shape of the basket in a solid white block. You take the basket by its two handles and tip it forward, and the salt slides out in a single heavy mass that breaks apart as it falls, cascading onto the floor in a tumble of white crystals and chunks and fine powder. The sound of it is a clean, rushing sound like a small waterfall, and it echoes very slightly in the enclosed space before being swallowed by the thick thatch. The new pile of salt is damp and dark compared to the older piles, its crystals still coated with the dense brine that the drying pan did not have time to remove, and it will need several days in the store before it is fully dry and ready for the market. You kneel down beside the pile and run your fingers through it, feeling the cool, wet texture of the crystals, the way they cling together in clumps that crumble at a touch. The salt is cold against your skin, surprisingly cold after the warmth of the afternoon, and you realize that your hands are still warm from the sun, and the work and the contrast is pleasant in a small, quiet way. You spend a few minutes arranging the new salt, pushing it into a neat cone with your hands, patting the sides to make them smooth and steep. The salt compresses under your palms with a soft crunching sound, and as you work you feel the last of the brine squeezing out between your fingers, cool and slippery. When the cone is shaped to your satisfaction, you wipe your hands on the rough linen of your shirt and stand back to look at it. A fresh white peak among the older grayer peaks, and you know that by tomorrow it will have formed its own thin crust, sealing itself against the air, waiting for the day when it will be loaded into sacks and taken to the barges at the quay. Now there is the sweeping, one of the oldest rituals of the saltern, the small act of care that closes each day's gathering. You walk to the corner of the store where the broom leans against the wall, a simple tool made of birch twigs bound together with a leather thong and fitted to a handle of ash. The twigs have been worn down over many sweepings so that their ends are soft and frayed, and they make a particular whispery sound when they move across the packed earth. You pick up the broom and feel its lightness after the weight of the basket and the scoop, and you begin to sweep the floor around the new pile, gathering the stray crystals that spilled during the pouring. The motion of sweeping is a slow, easy motion, the broom moving back and forth in long, smooth arcs, the twigs scratching gently against the earth. The salt grains collect in a thin white line ahead of the broom, a line that grows thicker and more defined with each pass, and you work your way methodically across the floor from the walls inward, clearing every inch of the hard earth. The sound of the broom is a steady shushing that fills the quiet store, a sound so soft and so repetitive that it is almost hypnotic, and your mind drifts as you work, moving back out across the pans and forward into the evening and around in slow circles that have no particular destination. You sweep around the base of each salt pile, careful not to disturb the crusted surfaces, and the broom traces the irregular outlines of the cones in a series of curving strokes. The salt that you gather is mostly fine powder, smaller and whiter than the crystals in the main piles, and it has a different texture, almost silky, that slides across the earth with very little resistance. When you have swept the whole floor, you have a small heap of this fine salt sitting in the middle of the open space, a heap no larger than your two fists together, and you scoop it up on the flat of your hand and scatter it back over the new pile where it settles like a dusting of snow on a white peak. You return the broom to its corner and stand for a moment in the center of the store, letting the quietness settle around you. The dim light, the cool air, the clean salt smell, the soft grey shapes of the piles in the shadows, all of it combines into a feeling of deep calm that is different from the calm of the open marsh but equally restful. The store is a place of endings, the place where the work of the pans finally comes to rest, and there is something satisfying about standing in the middle of it and knowing that you have added to it today, that one of these white piles is yours. The light coming through the gaps between the wall planks has shifted while you worked, the bright lines on the floor having moved further towards the door, and you know that the afternoon is advancing and there is still the sluice to check before you walk home. You pick up the empty basket and carry it out of the store, pausing to pull the door closed behind you, and the leather hinges groan, the same groan as before, a sound that seems to mark the end of one thing and the beginning of another. Outside, the sun is noticeably lower, the shadows noticeably longer, and the heat of the day has begun its slow retreat towards the coolness of evening. You step back onto the bank and turn towards the tidal creek, the basket light on your shoulder now, and you leave the salt store behind you, with its quiet dimness and its clean, dry smell and its patient white piles waiting in the dark. The afternoon has now given way to early evening, and the quality of the light has changed so completely that the marsh seems a different place from the one you worked in at midday. The sun is a great orange disk suspended just above the line of the sea, its lower edge already beginning to flatten against the horizon, and the light that it casts is a deep, rich gold that turns the clay banks to bronze and sets the water in the pans on fire. Every surface that can reflect is reflecting. The larger pans blazing like sheets of polished copper, the crystallization pans glowing with a softer rose gold sheen, and even the mud in the channels has taken on a warm amber tint that makes it look almost soft, almost welcoming. The shadows are now very long, stretching eastward across the marsh in bands of deep purple grey, and they are cool when you step into them, noticeably cooler than the sunlit clay just inches away. You walk along the bank towards the tidal creek, your empty basket light on your shoulder and your rake balanced in your other hand, and the walk is the same walk you made in the morning, but in reverse, the landmarks appearing in a different order, the light coming from a different direction. The creek lies at the eastern edge of the Saltern, a wide winding channel of darker water that connects the marsh to the Solent, and it is the source of everything, the gate through which the sea enters and leaves, the beginning and the end of the long, slow journey that the water makes through the pans. At the highest point of the creek, where the earthen wall of the marsh meets the water, stands the main sluice gate, a heavy structure of oak and iron that controls the flow of the tide into the reservoir. You reach the sluice gate as the sun is just beginning to touch the horizon, and you set down your basket and rake on the bank beside it. The gate is a simple thing in principle, but a substantial thing in construction. A great wooden board, perhaps 4 feet wide and 3 feet high, that slides up and down in grooves cut into 2 massive oak posts set deep into the clay. The board is made of 3 thick planks joined edge to edge with iron straps, and its surface is dark with age and water, the grain of the wood raised into a pattern of fine ridges that run vertically from top to bottom. An iron ring is bolted to the center of the top edge, and from this ring a rope of tarred hemp runs up over a simple wooden roller and down again to a cleat on the bank where you can make it fast. The whole mechanism is heavy and slow and requires a steady pull to operate, but it is reliable, having served the Saltern for longer than anyone can remember. You stand beside the gate and look out across the creek towards the sea, which is visible now as a thin line of silver at the edge of the marsh, and you watch the tide for a moment to read its state. The tide is still out, the water in the creek low and sluggish, the dark mud banks on either side exposed and glistening with the wetness that the retreating sea has left behind. The mud is pockmarked with the holes of small creatures, crabs and worms and the tiny shellfish that live in the estuarine's silt, and here and there a stranded pool of water reflects the orange sky in a bright, irregular mirror. The smell of the creek at low tide is rich and organic, a smell of mud and salt and decay that is not unpleasant but simply fertile. The smell of a place where life and death are constantly exchanging places. But the tide is turning. You can see it in the way the water at the center of the channel has begun to move. A slow, glassy slide upstream that is barely perceptible at first, but steady once you have noticed it. The current is not a current of waves or ripples, but a smooth, silent lifting, the whole body of the water rising together as the sea pushes inward from the solent. A small branch that was lying motionless on the mud begins to float, then to drift, then to travel upstream with a gentle purpose, and you know that the tide will be high enough to reach the sluice within the hour. You turn your attention back to the gate itself and inspect it with the care that you give to all the mechanisms of the saltern. The wood is sound, the iron strap still holding tight, the rope showing no signs of fraying that would worry you. The grooves in the oak posts are clear of debris, the clay packed tightly around their bases to prevent leaks, and the board itself slides easily when you test it with a slight upward pull on the rope. Everything is in order, as it almost always is, and the check is more a ritual than a necessity. A small act of attention that closes the working day. Now you loosen the rope from its cleat and begin to raise the gate, pulling steadily downward on the free end so that the board lifts in its grooves with a wet, sucking sound. The motion is slow because the board is heavy and the water pressure on the creek side is already beginning to build as the tide rises, but you are not in a hurry, and you let the rope move through your hands at the pace that feels right, a hand's width at a time. The gate rises inch by inch, and as it does, a thin sheet of water begins to slide over the top of the board and fall into the reservoir on the other side, a glassy curtain that sparkles in the golden light and makes a soft, continuous sound like a whispered note held for a very long time. You raise the gate to the height that experience has taught you is right for this stage of the tide, perhaps 6 inches above the sill, and you make the rope fast again on the cleat, checking the knot with a tug. The water flowing over the gate is clear and cold, straight from the open sea, and it carries with it the memory of the great deep channels and the wide blue water beyond the solent. It pours into the reservoir with a quiet, steady rushing that will continue for several hours, replenishing the supply that the day's evaporation has consumed, starting the long, slow journey through the pans all over again. There is something deeply satisfying about this sound, the sound of the sea returning, the sound of the cycle beginning anew, and you stand beside the gate for a moment longer just to listen to it. The sun has now half sunk below the horizon, and the colors in the sky are intensifying even as they darken. The gold at the horizon has deepened to a rich orange red, and above it the sky grades through bands of rose and lavender and pale green to the deep blue of the coming night. A few thin clouds are suspended high overhead, and they have caught the last of the sunlight on their undersides, blowing pink and coral against the darkening blue. The water in the pans reflects all of this perfectly, the colors repeated in the still surfaces with an exactness that makes it hard to tell where the sky ends and the earth begins, and for a few minutes the whole marsh is a single seamless bowl of color and light. You pick up your basket and your rake, and begin the walk back along the banks, retracing your path through the saltern for the final time today. The walk is slow and easy, your body tired in a pleasant way, your mind quiet and unhurried. You pass the crystallization pans and glance into them as you go, checking the state of the brine one last time, noting the faint white haze that is already beginning to form again on the bottoms, as the cooling water releases a little more salt. The pans are still and dark now, their surfaces no longer reflecting the sky but absorbing it, turning the bright colors into deep muted tones of violet and gray. The middle pans are calm, their denser brine barely rippled by the evening breeze that has begun to stir from the land, a breeze that carries the scent of dry grass and warm earth rather than the salt smell of the day. The birds are settling down for the night, their calls becoming fewer and further apart, and the insects have shifted to a lower, slower drone that will fade entirely as the darkness deepens. The wind pump creaks on, its wheel turning steadily in the land breeze, and the sound is comforting now, a familiar marker of place and time that tells you exactly where you are and what you are doing. You reach the point on the bank where you sat at midday, the crate still standing in the lee of the wind pump, and you pause there for a moment to look back across the whole spread of the saltern. The scene before you is one of extraordinary quiet beauty, The pans laid out in their neat grid, the water in them dark and still, the banks between them glowing faintly with the last of the light. The sky is now almost completely dark in the east, the first stars beginning to appear as tiny points of silver in the deepening blue, and in the west the band of color at the horizon is shrinking and fading, a last ribbon of orange that will soon be gone. The sea is invisible now, lost in the gathering darkness, but you can still smell it, the clean salt smell that never quite leaves the marsh. You turn away from the pans and begin the walk towards the path that leads inland, your bare feet finding the familiar way along the bank, your basket and rake light in your hands. The day is done, the work is complete, the sluice is set, the salt is stored, and the marsh is settling into its nighttime stillness. You feel the quiet satisfaction that comes from a day lived in rhythm with the slow systems of water and sun and earth, a satisfaction that is not sharp or loud, but deep and calm, like the tide itself turning under the stars. The path that leads inland from the saltern is the same path you walked in the darkness before dawn, but now you walk it in the opposite direction and in a different kind of darkness, the soft gathering twilight of a summer evening rather than the deep black of early morning. The light has faded so gradually that you can hardly say when day became night. It was simply that at one moment the sky was a pale washed gold, and at the next it was a deep dusky blue. And now as you make your way along the packed earth track, the blue is darkening further towards a velvet black that will soon be full of stars. Your feet know this path so well that they find the way without two eyes, avoiding the small stones in the shallow ruts, stepping over the exposed root at the bend, slowing where the ground becomes slightly softer near the creek bridge, and you let them do their work while your gaze rests on the sky ahead of you. The air has cooled considerably now, the stored heat of the day rising out of the clay and the water and drifting away into the upper atmosphere, and the coolness feels pleasant on your face and arms after the long hours of sun. It is not a sharp coolness, not the kind that makes you shiver, but a gentle dropping of temperature that is just enough to remind you that the day is over and the night is beginning. The breeze that stirred the marsh grass at sunset has eased to a near calm, and the air is so still that you can hear the sound of your own footsteps very clearly, the soft padding on the packed earth, the occasional crunch of a small shell or a dried piece of reed, the faint swish of the rake handle moving against the fabric of your shirt as you shift it on your shoulder. The sounds of the marsh are different now from what they were at any other time of day. The birds have mostly fallen silent, the last of the curlews having given their final bubbling calls a while ago, and the insects that buzz so persistently through the heat have quieted to a low intermittent hum that seems to come from very far away. In their place there is a new set of sounds, the sounds of the marsh settling into night, the soft rustle of the reeds as they brush against each other in the faintest movement of air, the occasional liquid plop of a fish or a frog breaking the surface of one of the channels, the distant bark of a fox from somewhere up on the ridge beyond the village. These sounds are all quiet sounds, sounds that seem to respect the darkness, and they come to you one at a time with long pauses in between, so that the overall impression is of a great peaceful silence that has wrapped itself around the landscape like a blanket. You cross the small wooden bridge over the creek, and the sound of your footsteps changes from the muffled pad of earth to the hollow drumming of planks, 5 steps that ring out softly in the still air, and then fade as you step back onto the path on the other side. Below the bridge the water is barely visible now, just a faint sheen of reflected starlight on the surface of the slow-moving current, and the tide that you watched beginning to rise earlier is now well on its way in, filling the channels from below, lifting the water level inch by silent inch. The sound of it is a gentle lapping at the mud banks, a sound so soft that it is almost not a sound at all, but a feeling, a sense of movement in the darkness that is more felt than heard. The path now takes you through the open marsh pastures, the wide, flat grasslands that lie between the saltern and the first hedgerows of the village. The grass on either side is the same pale silvery gold that you saw in the morning, but now it has been transformed by the darkness into a ghostly grey-white that seems to glow faintly with its own light, the last of the twilight catching on the dry seed heads and making them stand out against the darker earth. The grass moves in a slow, gentle wave as the night breeze passes over it, a wave that travels across the field in a long, sighing motion, and the sound of it is a dry whispering that seems to come from everywhere at once. the sound of 1,000 stalks brushing against each other, a sound that has been heard on this marsh for as long as there has been grass and wind. Above you, the stars are coming out in their full summer profusion. They have been appearing one by one over the last hour, the brightest first, the fainter ones filling in as the darkness deepens, and now the whole dome of the sky is thick with them, a great scatter of silver points that stretches from horizon to horizon. The Milky Way is visible as a faint, luminous band that runs from north to south, a river of light that mirrors the creeks and channels of the marsh below, and if you stop and look up at it for a moment, you can see the darker patches within it, the clouds of dust and gas that hide the more distant stars. There is no moon tonight, or if there is, it has not yet risen, and so the stars have the sky to themselves, and they shine with a particular clarity that is only possible far from the lights of towns and cities. You stop for a moment on the path, not because you are tired, but because the beauty of the night invites a pause, and you stand there with your rake and your empty basket and look up at the great arch of stars above you. The constellations are old friends, their patterns learned in childhood and never forgotten. The plough hanging in the northern sky, its handle pointing towards the pole star which sits steady and true, as it always does. Cassiopeia's crooked W climbing the eastern sky. The bright beacon of Jupiter low in the south, its steady golden light quite different from the twinkling of the stars. You name them to yourself, not with words, but with a kind of silent recognition, the way you might nod to a neighbor across a field, and then you resume your walking. The path begins to rise very slightly now, as it leaves the marsh proper and climbs towards the first of the inland fields, and the ground under your feet changes from soft dark earth to a firmer stonier surface that tells you the village is not far. The smell of the air changes too, the sharp, clean brine smell giving way gradually to the sweeter scents of dry grass and hedgerow flowers, and the faint wood smoke from the cottages ahead. A dog barks somewhere in the distance, a single short bark that is not an alarm but a greeting, and then it is quiet again. You pass the first of the hedgerows, the same hawthorn and blackthorn that you passed this morning, and in the darkness they are dense black shapes on either side of the path, their leaves rustling with the small movements of roosting birds settling themselves for the night. The village is visible now as a cluster of darker shapes against the dark sky, the low silhouettes of the cottages with their thatched roofs and their small square windows, and here and there a faint glow of candlelight spilling out through a half-open shutter. The lane that runs between the cottages is empty and quiet, the doors all closed, the garden still, and the only sound is the soft murmur of voices from inside one of the houses where a family is sitting together at the end of their day. You walk past the cottages without stopping, your footsteps silent on the packed earth of the lane, and you come at last to your own door, a low wooden door set into a whitewashed wall under a roof of thick brown thatch. You lean the rake against the wall beside the door, where it will wait for you until tomorrow morning, and you set the empty basket down beside it. The water bottle is still in the basket, warm now and nearly empty, and you will refill it in the morning before you leave. You push open the door and step inside, into the cool, dark interior of the cottage, and the familiar smell of the place wraps around you. The dry smell of the thatch, the faint smokiness of the hearth, the clean scent of the linen that hangs from the rafters. You move through the darkness without needing a light, your hands finding the table and the bench and the clay pitcher of water that stands on the sill, and you drink deeply, the water cool and fresh after the long dry day. You sit down on the low bed in the corner of the room and pull off your shoes, which you have been carrying all this way, and you feel the cool earth of the floor under your bare feet. The tiredness that has been gathering in your body all day settles over you now, a gentle heaviness in your limbs, a pleasant ache in your shoulders and back, and you lie back on the straw mattress with a long, slow breath. The window beside the bed is a small square opening fitted with a wooden shutter that you have left ajar, and through the gap you can see a single bright star hanging in the dark sky, the same star that you watched rise above the pans at dusk, now watching over you as you rest. But the story does not end with you, because even as you lie there drifting towards sleep, the marsh continues its slow, quiet work under the stars. The salt is still forming in the crystallization pans, the cooling brine releasing its dissolved load crystal by crystal onto the silt floor, a new crust beginning to grow in the darkness, just as it grew the night before and will grow the night after. The tide is still rising in the creek, the water pushing further and further into the channels, lifting the surface of the reservoir inch by inch until it reaches the mark on the sluice post that indicates fullness. The wind pump turns slowly in the night breeze, its slatted wheel flashing faintly as it touches the starlight. Its creak a steady, comforting sound that has marked the passing of the hours on this marsh for longer than anyone can remember. The salt store sits quiet and dark, its white piles invisible in the blackness, but still there, still waiting, still holding the harvest of many days in their crusted cones. The marsh under the stars is a place of profound and ancient peace, a landscape that is being shaped by human hands but that belongs ultimately to the water and the earth and the slow turning of the seasons. The pans lie in their neat grid, dark rectangles of still water that reflect the constellations perfectly, and if you could stand on the bank now and look down into them, you would see the stars duplicated in the brine. Two heavens for the price of one, the real sky and the reflected sky lying side by side in perfect silence. The curlews sleep with their heads tucked under their wings, the herons stand motionless in the shallows, the small creatures of the mud go about their hidden business, and the salt grows grain by grain, layer by layer, as it has grown every dry summer night since the first salt makers dug the first pans. A gentle breeze moves across the marsh, stirring the surface of the larger ponds into a faint shimmer of starlight, and then it passes on, and the water returns to stillness. The sound of the sluice gate is a distant whisper, the sea still feeding the reservoir, the cycle still turning. And somewhere in the darkness, leaning against a whitewashed wall in a quiet village, a wooden rake waits for the morning, its tines still carrying a faint white crust of salt, ready for another day of patient work under the summer sun.